So high quality evaluations help us to understand the impact of our work and how we can improve our work to provide better services for the public good. Departments across government have been asked by the Cabinet Office and Treasury to set up evaluations of their projects and their programmes to support bids for the 2021 spending review. In this session, the National Statistician, Professor Sir Ian Diamond, will be speaking about the importance of evaluation, his personal experiences evaluating, and about his views on methodology and the proportionality of evaluation designs. Apologies again for the delay. Thank you very much. And Sir Ian, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Hey everybody, I'm really sorry that it's late. I actually was getting on for more than halfway through the talk, so I'm going to start again, and I'm going to try and do it at something of a gallop. I will miss out some of the stories of designing evaluation strategies on planes full of American tourists drinking hurricanes and wearing flip-flops and wondering what on earth a man sitting next to them was doing with an evaluation strategy, and concentrate solely on the algebra, and that's what we're here for. Except actually evaluation is much more than that. And I just wanted to start by saying I just think it's such an important agenda that the government has been absolutely right in expecting that evaluation strategies will be part of everything that comes in the next spending reviews. And I've been privileged to be part of the evaluation task force, which I think has done a really good job in setting an agenda and a methodology, which I think is absolutely bang on. Next slide, please. The fundamental question, which really is pretty simple, why evaluate? Well, the bottom line is we exist in the civil service, it seems to me, to improve public policy in order to have an impact to improve the lives of all our citizens. And if we, that's what we all wake up in the morning worrying about doing. And of course, we need to know how that's going. We need to know how we are doing and whether our policy is working, and we need to know whether there are bits of our policy that are working better than other bits. And we do that by attempting to devise evaluation strategies which produce statistics which tell us about the journey that we are on and the ultimate destination, and which improve. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do here is improve public value and improve services for our citizens. Next slide, please. I'm going to say a few words about my own evaluation journey. It started a very long time ago. Before evaluation, really, in measurement. And I was privileged just after my PhD to spend some time working with data from the World Fertility Survey. This is a magnificent international effort to understand in a internationally comparable way, using comparable surveys, all things to do with childbearing, infant and child mortality, and the role of education in low-income countries. I was enormously privileged to work on these data, because what they gave you was, for the very first time in many countries, really strong baselines from which to look at the impact of various programs. And some of the programs that were being put in place were based on the observation that in many parts of the world, couples were not able to access the means to have the children they wanted when they wanted to have them, and therefore putting in place some programs to provide access would be a good thing to do. But in doing that, could we monitor and evaluate the success? And there was a lot of discussion about that, and it moved further into some of the programs around improving immunization for children, which in my opinion has been one of the main reasons that we've been able magnificently to reduce infant mortality in many parts of the world. Still, in some parts of the world, far higher than we would like, but we have made a lot of progress. And in the late 1980s, the Overseas Development Administration, which is the forerunner of the Department for International Development, which of course is the forerunner of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, really became interested in evaluation, and the use of log frames. The late Neil Price was brilliant at putting these together, and I helped and worked with him a little bit on that, and taught a lot about how what a log frame was and how you thought about it. I'll say a few words about them later. At the same time, the US Agency for International Development put a lot of effort into saying, we, particularly in their health programs and particularly in their reproductive health programs, were very, very interested in evaluating and measuring the impact of their programs. And they put a lot of money into a program called Measure Evaluation, which was led by the University of North Carolina through a wonderful woman called Amy Choi. And that program invited me to chair their technical advisory group. And so for many years in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I put a lot of effort into helping them really improve the methodology of evaluation, conducted very many workshops all over the world. And I know that many of the people that I was privileged to work with on those workshops have taken forward evaluation in many, many ways. Two examples, next slide, please. Two examples of the work that's worked. Some work with the Australian economist who's always worked in America, so I always think he's American, Dennis Alberg, and I did some work on whether family planning programs were effective, and that was part of a book that Dennis put together for the Australian government ahead of the 1994 Cairo Population Conference, which ended with the Australian government putting some significant money into programs which were then evaluated properly. And then together with that, Anna Graham and Lawrence Moore, I undertook some work to do a randomized controlled trial on a new method of personal and relationship education, which again, what we did was take a very large sample of classes in schools and gave the new method to a randomized set of classes, use old method on which we have baseline data on the other classes, and then we were able to show that the new method worked pretty well, and it was then taken into use. So these things work. I use randomized controlled trials deliberately. Next slide, please, because when people talk these days, and I say these days, about evaluation, a lot of talk is made of randomized controlled trials. Can I just, before I talk about methodology, just say though that while you can talk about methodology all day, and gosh, I love talking about methodology, there is absolutely no compensation at all for clarity of thought. Clarity of thought. Simply, you need to sit down very, very carefully and think, what is it that I am trying to achieve here? What's the ultimate destination? What does success look like? What's the journey we're trying to go on? What are the milestones? How am I going to measure them? But in thinking about milestones, don't just think about the inputs, think about the outputs. And fundamentally, that ultimate destination has to be an outcome. Really important. Too often we evaluate the inputs, but not the outcomes. And these days, people talk a lot about how do you do this? Well, we'll do a randomized controlled trial. As I've just indicated, I've done randomized controlled trials. I believe they are useful. However, I would say that they're not the only method. I am an enormous fan of quasi experimentation, and to be absolutely honest, if I go back a very, very long time ago when I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics, one would write essays in which one said that randomized controlled trials you couldn't really use them in the kinds of social programs that we're talking about, and that you had to use quasi experimentation. I think my view and most other people's views have perhaps changed on that now, but still I wouldn't say blindly. You must use a randomized controlled trial. In fact, I actually personally would rarely use one. Quasi experimentation, on the other hand, absolutely fantastic. What do I mean by that? Well, you need a baseline. Fundamentally, 100% you need a baseline. Then you put your intervention together, hopefully with some kind of control group, some kind of match control group, and then you follow them through. So you've got a decent before and after design, and you can see how the intervention works against the controls. So you've not got the randomization, but you've still managed to bring in a degree of overtime analysis. And I'm a huge fan in that situation of multi-level longitudinal designs, and the great American economist David Gilkey, I think, has showed the benefits of those. The bottom line here, of course, is that if you're interested in individuals, individuals in a village or a town or a city take individual decisions, but they do so in the context of the availability of services or the culture of that area. So you have multi-levels of influence, the individual and the area, and therefore you need to take a multi-level approach, but you still need a baseline, and you still need to follow things over time. And I do think there is an enormous amount to be said for multi-level longitudinal designs. Now, I've put after only in there too often in this world. I would have to say that I have, seen people undertake a really interesting project and then think, gosh, we really ought to evaluate this. If we are going to evaluate it, we should have started earlier, but actually we'll manage with an after only. I'm not going for a moment to say to you, colleagues, that you shouldn't do some post hoc evaluation if you haven't got anything else. I wouldn't say that at all. I would say you only do it as a very last resort. I do think it's incredibly important. That's one of the brilliant things about what this government is doing. I think it's incredibly important that we plan the evaluation at the same time as we develop the policy intervention, and so it's there from day zero. Incredibly important. I would also say that while I'm an enormous believer in measuring things quantitatively, there is also a lot you can get from qualitative work. The social psychologist Roger Ingham has shown an enormous amount of evaluation of different programs to using just qualitative data. And again, though, qualitative opportunities need to be designed with methodological rigor, and there is real rigor in qualitative design and analysis. And then I believe you can, and sometimes there are some things that you do which frankly is not terribly easy to get a quantitative measure to bring that qualitative in. And I think sometimes there is real advantage to linking quantitative and qualitative data and bringing them together. With my colleagues Suhai and Phil Cooper in the early 1990s, we wrote a piece on how to integrate qualitative and quantitative data, and the kind of punchline of that piece of work was it's hard, and my view is still it's hard, and so again, I do think it's important to bring both quantitative and qualitative approaches, but you need to be really careful that that the two have rigor associated with them, and the way they are brought together has rigor. Next slide, please. Just at ONS, I think it's important that we really ask the question: do we deliver the business cases that we commit to, and what evidence do we have for the value? So what's the value, and how have we changed? These things can only be done by having a really clear view of what's going to happen. Next slide, please. And in government, here's the 21 setups, the central evaluation team. So if you've got a large program, liaise with the central evaluation team, which I think is a brilliant innovation, great group of people. Develop a theory of change, then develop the M&E plans, theory of change and the M&E plans into the business case, and then reporting back so that we can celebrate success, and learn lessons for the future. This is, I think, the governance, and that's where we need to have right across government. Next slide, please. And here at ONS, we have a pretty clear plan that we just follow. So there's a clear delivery plan, and there are 4 pillars to each strategy: radical, ambitious, inclusive, and sustainable. And at the right-hand side, we know which parts of each program are green, amber, or red. And in this case, I'm delighted to have a piece of slide which shows nothing's red. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that always great? But clearly, amber's lots to be thinking about. Next slide, please. So what do you need to do? Having just said that, just to say, when you're setting up your evaluation, start with a theory of change. What does success look like? What's the journey I'm going on? What are the milestones? What are my inputs? What are my expected outputs? And what are my final outcomes? Really understand who your population is. I know this sounds pretty straightforward, but the bottom line is, we must have inclusivity in evaluation. If we don't have inclusivity, then not everybody has a voice, and that's got to be wrong. So make sure we've got the population right. I'm going to talk about logic maps in a moment. Get yourself a draft monitoring evaluation plan. If you're going to get an external because you're not doing it yourself, well, okay, do that now. Get your baseline study done, midterm evaluation, anything you're going to fine tune the program. Midterms are really, really important because you can, it's a bit like setting out on a journey and you suddenly realize that there's some roadworks ahead, so we'll go a different way. You've got to be prepared to be agile and do that, then the final evaluation in the rank. So really important. If the program doesn't work, should I just perhaps not tell anyone about it? Absolutely not. Transparency has to be critical. Everybody here will do this professionally. Sometimes stuff doesn't work, and learning from that is just as important. And the one thing I think, as across the analysis function, and isn't it wonderful that there are 17,000 analysts in government across the analysis function, transparency is one of our keywords, and I think it has to be, if you like, driven into our DNA. Next slide, please. So logic frameworks, I've talked about. I just love logic frameworks. And, too often people think, oh my God, this is so complicated. What is it? Actually, it's really, really, really simple. And the reason it's simple is because it's logical. And I just wish that the great Neil Price, who sadly died a while ago, would be here, because he would just be so proud that we were doing this session around this sort of stuff. And the bottom line here: what's the current state? Where are we trying to get to? What are the activities? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the outcomes? And what is the impact? Really needs, coming back, to where I started. Nothing more than real clarity of thought. Real clarity of thought. If we've got the full hour, and I do want to leave time for some conversation, I'd say a few more words. But just to say, if anyone ever wants to talk about logical frameworks, I'm your man. I'll talk to anyone about them at any time. I love them. But it is about clarity of thought. Next slide, please. Then just a few words about stuff. Ethics are absolutely critical here. I mean, there is, if you're going to do an intervention, it needs to have ethical approval, and that ethical approval needs to be based on the principle that we maximize benefit and minimize harm. Absolutely, that we are respectful of people's rights and dignity, that we have fairness and equality and integrity right the way through. Now, you might think that's all pretty obvious, but it is so important. And that's why I think it is critical. I can't imagine how you would have a monitoring evaluation strategy that did not have ethical approval, and that ethics seems to me to be just a no-brainer. Getting that right and thinking that through is terribly, terribly important. Next slide, please. I said a few words about transparency. I think that transparency is important. Integrity is incredibly important. We learn. I'm not going to pretend that everything I've ever done worked, but I do hope that when stuff didn't work, we learned from it and we improved on it going forward. And then the point about objectivity and impartiality is so critically important. There's an enormous literature, particularly in clinical trials, that the only trials that get published are the ones that work. It seems to me that you learn as much from trials that don't work as that do. And I think we do need, and in government, we should just have a complete policy that we publish everything, works, not works, whatever. And that seems to me to, frankly, be the right way to do things with integrity and to do things with objectivity. Next slide, please. And the final thing, just before we move to questions, and I have tried to do that at a gallop, Marzia, just to make sure that we've got some time for questions, is to come back to the issue of cost. As I said in my remarks, too often people end up designing something which just costs an enormous amount of money, and I have seen them when they start to get more than the intervention themselves. That can't be right. If Amy Choi were here, and I defer to Amy on just about everything, she's wonderful, she would probably say there's no possibility of saying what percentage of the overall budget should be on monitoring and evaluation, but if you ask me, 5. And I think that, so there isn't a number, but if you were to actually twist my arm behind my back and ask me for that number, I would say 5% is the right answer. But equally, if it was a bit more, a bit less, that's fine. But you need enough to be able to answer these questions in a coherent and sensible way. But equally, you also need to remember that what you're trying to do is do the policy in the first place. Marzia, I'm going to stop there and really looking forward to a dialogue on absolutely anything.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Apologies all, as I was sharing my screen, I haven't had a chance to read through the questions yet, so I'm going to read them out slowly now. So the first question is, do we need some kind of rigid gatekeeper to prevent policies going forward without a clear theory of change and or evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, I simply think we do need a commitment across government that we only take policies forward that do have that theory of change and a way of understanding them, understanding the success or otherwise of them as they go along. And that's why I'm quite excited about the way in which government is saying that you've got to have a strategy around any major spending review bids, and I just think it should be the culture within departments that maybe the chief analyst or someone signs off the evaluation strategy. I mean, there are different people who do it, but it does seem to me that it ought to be just part of what we in government do.
Fantastic, thank you. Mark says, one of the biggest problems we face as analysts is stressing the difference between monitoring and evaluation to policy colleagues. Often, policies are rolled out with the expectation that collecting some MI is an evaluation without proper analytical engagement. Can Sir Ian comment on what he sees as the difference between monitoring and evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, I think really good question. And the first part of the answer is that management information is absolutely, part of monitoring and evaluation, but it isn't everything. So, and too often, management information, in my opinion, which is incredibly important, we've just pulled off a census which had just the best management information, but it's so often management information is about inputs. Have I got the right inputs? And that's only part of the evaluation. And so you actually need to also be able to, as I've said all along, measure the outputs, the outcomes, and the impact. And it's very rare that you will get the impact and the outcomes from management information. So I think it's incredibly important that we collect management information, but it is, in my opinion, much more than management information that is in monitoring and evaluation.
Brilliant, thank you. Megan asks, how important do you think it is that evaluations are completed by external organizations and contractors for impartiality?
I don't actually. Just being absolutely frank, Megan. And the reason I say that is that one of the things that we do as analysts across government is live by various codes. So all the statisticians live by the code of practice of statistics. It's something we live by, and that talks about impartiality, it talks about objectivity. So all the things I have talked about today, I fundamentally believe are part of the daily business and the daily work of analysts in government. I take a personal view that if one has, if you like, a resource issue, or if there are particular skill sets that are needed, you might want to bring in some support. But frankly, it's what we should, as analysts across government, in my opinion, be able to do monitoring evaluation in an independent, objective, transparent, and with full integrity.
Thank you. The next question from Jasmine leans into this a little bit. She says that it's really great and refreshing to hear your thoughts on robust qualitative research and ethics. I think both are things that can be overlooked or taken for granted. Do you have any advice for how to ensure they are embedded in evaluations?
Yeah, really, really good question. I mean, and again, the point about ethics, which I'm totally passionate about, comes back to the original first question, if I may say so, which was, these things need to get signed off. And I cannot imagine the person signing off a piece of work in this arena that without it having a proper ethical approval strategy. The first point. Second point, on qualitative work, I mean, look, I think the government social research colleagues are just brilliant. And I know that those that I talk to are all with me about the rigor of qualitative research. And again, I think, it's almost the case, particularly with major programs, that whoever is agreeing the monitoring evaluation strategy may need more than one person. I wouldn't always claim to know how to do everything, but I know a person who does. And so getting advice is incredibly important, but bringing that rigor is just so important because, it's the oldest, I mean, I don't need to tell everybody, if you, there's always a quick answer to everything, but the problem is it's normally wrong. Getting the rigor and doing it properly is the only way that we will properly understand what has worked and what hasn't worked, and what has not worked, as I've said a couple of times, is equally important as what has worked.
Great, thank you. Another brilliant question next is, could you please speak to the balance between the need for fidelity of implementation for robust summative evaluation versus the desire, ethics, and need for tweaking interventions in real time to respond to feedback as it comes back? Should one be prioritized over the other in government?
You said, Marcia, here's a good question. I could quite easily speak for an hour on that, so I'll be honest. So if in what I say it does sound quite brief, it's because that's a really, really big question. I do think, though, that we live in the real world, and at the end of the day, if we're going along through an evaluation and we're saying, hey, while we may have a theory of change to the end, but actually we've identified that we need to be agile and change this, but through changing, we will get to the impact in a better way, or indeed to a similar impact, then we have to have that agility and we have to be prepared to do it. Okay, it means you end up with a slightly different evaluation and a different program to the one you started with, but you will have, in my opinion, in taking that decision, improved public value, potentially saved public money, and, in my opinion, done a better job.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we may have time for 2 more questions. The next one is, how do we raise the public profile, awareness, and transparency of important evaluation work?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think we have not been, my observation is, perhaps as really good at celebrating the successes. And one of the things that I am passionate about is that where there are good evaluations, we should be shouting about them from the highest hilltops, and we should be encouraging ministers to speak about them, and we should be prepared to share our methodology in the broadest sense. This is just something that government is doing unbelievably well. We, as analysts across government, are at the heart of. We need to be so proud of that, and we need to share it as much as we can in the broadest sense.
Brilliant, thank you. Last question from Francesca. She says the one challenge for her is getting policy colleagues to understand the value of theory-based evaluation, which is often most suitable method in her space, which is energy, because it doesn't provide a number. What do you think can be done to champion the value of qualitative evaluation approaches in government, especially where experimental approaches aren't feasible?
Francesca, that's a really good question. And again, I do think that we need to work with our senior policy colleagues, and I should say that I have had a number of conversations with Tamara Finkelstein, who leads the policy profession, and I've got a conversation coming up with Jonathan Mills, who works with her. And I think the whole idea of evaluation and evaluation methodologies I want to raise, because it does seem to me that analyst colleagues need to work hand in glove with policy colleagues, and that means there needs to be dual learning. We, as analysts, have a lot to learn about the development and delivery of policy, but at the same time, there's a two-way street here in what can be evaluated. And Francesca, I'm with you that we need to get that message across, and that message needs to come at all levels. My job is to communicate with people like Tamara, but we need to make sure it's happening at all levels. And Marcia, I could go on all day talking about this. It's been a pleasure, and I hope colleagues have found it useful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Serene, for presenting and sharing your knowledge, and thank you all for attending this session. Apologies again for the technical glitches, and I've seen now that I've missed a few questions from Slido, which I will pass on to Serene, and we can email those.
If you pass it on, I'll send a written answer.
Brilliant, thank you so much. For everybody else, please remember to get involved in all the other activities taking part during Analysis in Government Month. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Analysis Function newsletter by emailing us at analysis.function@ons.gov.uk. Thank you very much and goodbye.